Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation's latest podcast of the current series, where we seek to address the urgent energy topics of today by hearing the opinions and the insights from our invited guests. The Al-Attiyah Foundation is an independent think tank aiming to provide robust and practical knowledge on global energy and sustainable development topics and communicate these for the benefit of the Foundation's members community. So, LNG Worldwide Ltd is a bespoke consulting company drawing on associates as required to provide services to large global energy companies and utilities, national energy companies, state energy agencies, independent developers, equity investors, banks, and law firms. So we turn to Patricia, who I shall now call Pat Roberts from LNG Worldwide Ltd to discuss this topic. LNG Worldwide Ltd was incorporated in 2005 and has advised clients on large-scale LNG infrastructure projects and commercial arrangements for businesses under development in startup and ongoing operations. Pat is actively involved in all the and offers 39 years of international experience in the oil and gas industry. From 1980 to 2004, Dr. Roberts worked for the Shell group of companies in their oil products and gas and power divisions. All her positions were in frontline commercial roles. Her last role was General Manager, Atlantic Basin of Shell International's LNG Co. She was involved in the startup of Shell's global LNG business as an LNG aggregator and major portfolio player. So good afternoon, Mrs. Roberts, and welcome to an Al-Attiyah Foundation activity. Should I call you Pat?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you.
Great, that's a lot easier. First, could you maybe set out, or in other words, briefly describe the range of your consultancy work within LNG Worldwide?
Yes, it moves with the times. So LNG consulting means anything commercial, from strategy, supply demand forecasting, price forecasting. But importantly for me, it's being active on the front line, structuring commercial agreements and seeing projects develop. I try to help with interactive training so that companies that are moving into the business can learn the new skills. And then I try to keep up to date by chairing conferences, moderating LNG panels, and actually doing podcasts. Just counted up. I think I've done 50 this year since April. So that just shows you how adaptive you've got to be.
But it also shows you just how expert you are in your field, which is wonderful to have you aboard on this podcast. The view of LNG as an energy fuel seems to have changed from it being merely a transition fuel towards a non-carbon world, which is what everybody wants eventually, including the new US president, of course, to that of a destination fuel. That is part of the final solution post-2050. Do you agree with that? And if so, what will LNG's role be? Just as a standby fuel, perhaps?
Yes, these words, transition and destination, they try to encapsulate how important LNG is going to be for how long. And talking to different people with different vested interests, you'll get different opinions. For me, I believe that it will always be the market that will decide how long LNG will be relevant. And what makes it even more complicated than just simply the market, we now also have this layering of governments who are setting climate change policies and laying out legislation. So it'll be a combination of the markets and the governments that decide how long LNG will stay relevant.
Yeah, exactly right. For new build generation plant, we're seeing that in some markets, wind and fossil generation is now more competitive, I think, than CCGT generation. So that beggars the question, is the role of gas now limited to existing plants?
No, I don't think so. I think the trilemma for any fuel is that it has to be clean, it has to be affordable, and it has to be reliable. So on demand whenever you want it, affordable relative to other fuels, and a lower carbon footprint. And I think we've got to be really careful when we talk about wind and fossil fuels and how they compete with gas. You see, you've got to look at the economics about how reliable these economics are. Can they keep generating all the time? Or are we talking about their economics when they are at peak performance? So if you want to make a fair comparison, you've got to look at the consistent cost of generating. And in this respect, gas is a baseload fuel. It is reliable. It's not intermittent. It won't cut out. And so I think that be careful when you see comments citing that wind and fossil fuels are suddenly very competitive. Question what the data is really about.
And perhaps that might be too early to say how competitive they are. Before 2050, it seems that the major opportunity for expansion of LNG markets lay with new markets facilitated by increased use of floating and regasification terminals. Is that fair, or are there still opportunities in developed markets, say by more coal to gas switching?
Oh my goodness, the most important market to look at going forward is China. In terms of materiality and in terms of government directives to grow, I think looking at China is the most important, where I think there's about 22 regasification terminals there in operation and at least as many under construction or development. So for me, China is the absolute prime market. You quite correctly said there are these floating storage and regasification units, and they are perfect to help open up new small pockets of demand. So countries like Cyprus, Ghana, Myanmar, the Philippines, all of these markets are going to be new to LNG in the next few years, and they're all going to be using FSRUs to start them up.
Now, at the beginning of 2020, the gas and, of course, LNG market was in surplus and gas prices crashed. Then came the pandemic, COVID-19. When do you think the gas demand will fully recover, discounting seasonal effects? Or are there green shoots? Has it recovered already?
I think, honestly, we've got to be very careful about what we define as a recovery. Is it a volume recovery and we're just simply selling the same amount of volume or more? Or is it about a volume and a value recovery where we're actually making money out of what we're selling? Because you see, already this year, even though it's the most difficult year in LNG's history, we will actually be growing our volume by about 5 to 10 million tonnes. So despite the pandemic, we will be growing. But the value is the thing that I look at all the time, because it's very easy to sell LNG at low prices and to compete out coal. But you will hear a lot of people saying demand is resilient. Now, frankly, we can operate on marginal costs for so long and we can force some coal to gas switching. But the real question for me is demand recovery comes when there is some value in the business. This year, it's about staying afloat. Next year, it'll be about cost cutting and it will be about trying to get that value curve back up again.
Okay, well, the US, of course, is expanding its LNG exports. But the model of toll processing seems unusual to other LNG marketers. So is the model of toll processing and the idea of an LNG option sustainable? In other words, can it exist outside the US export market?
A really important question, because the US has been incredibly successful at developing itself from a standing start into being in the top 3 producers in the world on the back of this tolling model. But 2020 has exposed the fact that this tolling model, with the option to cancel cargoes and pay a fee in lieu of loading, is an expensive option. I mean, it costs at least $9 or $10 million to cancel a single cargo. That's the level of the fee that you have to pay. And what this model has exposed in 2020 is that the US is really becoming the marginal swing supplier. So when there are big surpluses, they're the first sort of production to be cut, and the off-takers bear that cost. Let me just put it in perspective for you. Roughly $1.8 billion has been paid by a variety of off-takers not to load their cargoes from the US this year. And they themselves have helped restabilize the global market for the many. So will this be sustainable, was your question. I think it's hard at the moment to see a lot of people wanting to sign up for it in the tolling model as is. But the US is full of a lot of creative business developers that keep adapting the business model and pushing the boundaries on with the project finance people on to how to structure these projects. So I think the old model has probably run its course, but there will be new models, adaptive models, to try to keep US LNG relevant.
Yes, there certainly will be, especially in the current climate of entrepreneurism, because needs must, and as you say, market driven. But we now see more publicity and studies aimed at methane emissions. Now, this appears to be an attack on natural gas, both by coal combined with carbon capture and by wind and solar power. So is the role of gas getting squeezed? Will the major gas producers now become much more active in reducing methane emissions?
Well, our role to stay relevant is to be as clean as possible. And over the last, I would say, 15 to 18 months, I have detected a very significant strategic shift in our business. And that strategic shift is to focus on the greenhouse gases which are caused through actually LNG's production and the liquefaction process itself and the LNG shipping. And the spotlight is on us. There's nowhere to hide. We have to plug those leaks. We have to reduce our carbon footprint, and we have to use LNG as a ship fuel wherever we can, so that we can stand behind the fact that our fuel is one of the cleanest possible.
So we're seeing that there is a lot of talk too about the need for sort of a portfolio of energy sources, plus remedial measures such as carbon capture and energy efficiency. So what do you think will be the dominant technologies moving forward, or will there be a series of local measures dependent on so many factors?
Yes, I think you've answered that question for me yourself. A portfolio is simply that. It's going to be a mix of fuels which try to meet this trilemma of requirements, which is clean, reliable, affordable. And it won't be any one single fuel that's got the single sort of silver bullet on this. So it will be a combination of different fuels. And that combination will be different in different countries. And that combination will be different over different time periods. So you can imagine that Europe will move at a different pace towards developing a clean portfolio to, say, countries in Asia. But what's encouraging, I think, is that we are leaning more and more on technology to do two things, to solve the problem of cleanliness of the fuel, but also at the same time to reduce costs. And here, I'm quite encouraged to see that LNG is going to fight its corner. It's going to fight its corner on the basis of being a good compromise fuel for this period in which we're transitioning to net zero. So you are going to see that the whole production of gas and the liquefaction process will become less carbon intensive. And you're going to see that the whole production of LNG will actually have an independent measurement and monitoring system, so that you can actually say what the carbon footprint is of a cargo of LNG. I think we'll see this within a few years.
So you mentioned there Asia and Europe, and I talked about the new president in the States, President Biden, who has a very definite green agenda. Let's move to the impact of that new administration on natural gas production. Do you think that infrastructure projects will now be much more difficult to implement in the US?
I think that there is always room for a good project. I think that the bar has been raised in terms of demonstrably showing that these are cleaner projects. So it will be incumbent upon all of the developers to show that they have absolutely minimized their carbon footprint in the production of LNG. Honestly, I think it is too early to say what will happen under the Biden administration. But I think that what I expect to see is an administration run a lot more on a multilateralist basis rather than unilateral, and more standards, more collective agreements, more international cooperation. And that means, I think, rejoining the Paris Agreement, reversing some of the very light regulation that you had on greenhouse gas emissions for US infrastructure. But it doesn't necessarily mean overall that our business will suffer greatly. I think it will actually upgrade the quality of it sustainably.
Well, as you know, politicians are backing green infrastructure plans, and the new Biden administration wants to spend what they estimate $2 trillion decarbonizing America's economy. That's a lot of money. The next COP is starting to be talked about as one where concrete actions will be proposed. So what sort of actions for mitigating CO2 emissions would you like to see starting to be implemented in the next few years?
I think that we have to have an international measurement and monitoring system, because how can you manage something that you can't measure? And you've got to have international standards that everyone signs up to. So this won't be single companies who say, here are my standards. It'll be a collaborative international standard where, as I said earlier, I think that within a short period of time, people will actually be able to say, here's the carbon footprint associated with this fuel that you're going to buy. And the customer will decide what premium they want to pay for cleaner fuels. And governments will decide how they want to polarize, people's buying behavior towards cleaner fuels. But let's not kid ourselves here. Cleaner fuels will come at a higher cost. And that's why the rate of energy transition probably isn't linear in every single country. That poorer countries that are saying, we need really affordable energy are still going to be battling for a long time, I think, to push the coal out of the mixture. But for me, for LNG, we have to look really at China and India and say, can we win the battle on promoting gas and LNG into these countries?
Two big questions. I think our time's up. Pat, sad to say, could have talked to you a lot more about LNG and where the focus should be on future energies. But for the moment, thank you very much for sharing your views with us on the future role of LNG. And watch this space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. I'm Stephen Cole. Thank you very much and goodbye.